the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the final in the lecture series here in 2024 at the Greek community, and it is our great pleasure to have our friend Professor Nikos Papastergiadis speaking tonight on the eternal return of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is normally understood as a moral duty to care for others and a political concept for extending the rights to citizenship. It reminds us that there is just one world and that there is an infinite cosmos that is beyond. Despite the difficulty of living with strangers and the challenge to grasp our place in boundless space, the original concept of cosmopolitanism that was developed by a group of philosophers in Athens who were all strangers to the polis reached all the way out to the cosmos. Throughout its evolution, cosmopolitanism has gained focus and it has been embedded in religious dogma attached to human rights associated with mobility, pinned to new communication technologies, and more recently extended into cosmological theories. Nikos brings a holistic approach to cosmopolitanism. He argues against the view that our place in this world is confined to specific regions and that an open-ended form of hospitality is an impossible ideal. He not only agrees with philosophers that we can extend our moral and political outlook to realise a cosmopolitan agenda, but also to accept the claim often made by artists that all humans possess a fundamental capacity to care, create, and connect. Artists have gone so far as to claim that their creative capacity is linked to a dual connection, companionship with others and the cosmos. Today, the separation of the cosmos and polis is no longer tenable, and as Nikos says, the cosmos is back. Nikos Papastergiadis is the director of the research unit in public cultures and a professor in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. He has recently returned from a 2-month visit to the National University of Singapore, where he was the William Lim Guest Professor in Culture and New Media Department. And in November, he will take up a position of Guest Professor at the University of Bologna. This lecture is based on his recent book, The Cosmos in Cosmopolitanism. It's my great pleasure to welcome Nikos to the floor.
Thank you, Jim. That's a very kind and warm introduction. And it's always a pleasure to be back here. And I want to underline and reiterate your words of acknowledgement of the country that you made. And thank you for everyone to come out to participate in tonight's event. As Jim says, the lecture I'm giving today is based on the book, The Cosmos and Cosmopolitanism, which was kindly hosted, the book launch of that here. But it's not going to be summarizing or repeating any of the arguments in that book, but just as you think one book is finished and you never want to touch that topic again, you, within a short period of time, realize there's so much more work to be done. So this is, volume 4, or the beginnings at least. Anyway, let me start with some rather obvious points. The idea of cosmopolitanism couldn't be further from our reality today. Of course, we know that throughout history, the concept and philosophy of idea keeps coming back again and again. No civilization is complete without some reference to cosmopolitanism. But the geopolitical realities today make it seem further and further from our grasp, making us feel like it's more impossible than ever before. Now, that is the standard view on cosmopolitanism, I suspect, today. I'm going to be arguing against it. And of course, there is a lot of arguments that have been made against cosmopolitanism throughout the history of cosmopolitanism, and philosophers have been very good at developing defenses of cosmopolitanism. For instance, it's very common to defend cosmopolitanism by saying that it's an essential tool for expanding the notion of human rights, for citizenship, so that everyone has a sense of place in the world and that justice can be delivered in a more equitable way. So if you want to believe in human rights, and if you want to believe in some kind of justice that isn't specific to your group, then you need some kind of concept of cosmopolitanism. Secondly, other philosophers argue that increasingly in this world, despite our fears and conflicts, we are living in much more mixed societies. Cosmopolitanism is a useful lens for understanding that demographic mixture and the cultural vitality that's generated from that. Thirdly, there's a more sophisticated and complex argument that's often made about how do you reconcile the tension between the idea of unconditional hospitality, that is, the idea of offering the right to stay to anyone in the world in your place, with your idea of absolute sovereignty. So you should have the right to decide who comes and when and under what terms, as Howard famously said. Now, of course, these two demands can never be reconciled. But the question is, do you subordinate hospitality to sovereignty, or do you subordinate sovereignty to hospitality? In reality, we're constantly oscillating between the two. This is the third defense. And cosmopolitanism is a useful way of realizing that unless we keep the two alive, neither of them makes sense. Sovereignty needs some kind of idea of hospitality to legitimate itself, and hospitality needs a host, someone who's sovereign. So in that sense, these ideas of defending hospitality constantly get reiterated. And in a sense, they help us. I can't see a thing here, Costa. Have we got any light on this part of the table? Eventually, I'm going to need to make reference to my notes. So far, I'm just winging it. But thank you. Are you struggling to hear me? Okay, sorry about that. I'll do that as well. So cosmopolitanism, therefore, is defended on the grounds that it's vital for justice, it's useful for understanding the value of cultural difference, and it's imperative for legitimating the moral order of any political system. Thank you. Now, these are honourable defences, and I've got no qualms, thanks, that's great, against them. I'm not arguing against these defences, but what I'm going to say is that even as honourable as those defences actually are, what they effectively do is defer the realisation of cosmopolitanism to some imaginary point in the future. You know, when we get all the circumstances right about political structures, moral order, and understand the value of cultural difference and multiculturalism, then we will have cosmopolitanism. So we defer that point of arrival to some point in the future, or you contract it to a rather small thing that says, well, it's a kind of useful little thing that we have as an optic for seeing some parts of our life. I'm going to present today an alternative view. I'm going to argue that, in fact, cosmopolitanism exists in all time and in all places. And I'm going to say not only does the idea of it recur in history, but the practice of it is continuous and constant. I will make some examples from art to demonstrate, but the examples from art are only part of the story. They're a very important part because they highlight the connection between cosmopolitanism and creation and creativity, but I also want to argue that, in fact, some of the ways in which we understand sociality, also the way in which we experience our social life and conduct ourselves in the world, those ideas also need radical revision. Well, because throughout history, these ideas of how we measure our society is dependent on the dominant political order. Now, in tribal societies, of course, people measured it according to the kinship networks. In imperial societies, of course, it was the structure of the empire. Now, we tend to measure our society according to national categories. Now, it may come as no surprise to you, therefore, that how we're going to see something like cosmopolitanism when the frameworks that we're using for measuring, registering, perceiving the phenomenon are derived from concepts which are antithetical to it. Cosmopolitanism is neither feudal, nor tribal, nor national, nor imperial. It's something else. But we've never developed optics and categories to identify, register, and classify. So that's part of the reason why it often appears to us as this kind of chimera, this ideal, and that its presence is so hard to find. But the other argument against cosmopolitan is that in this day and age, the circumstances of the world couldn't be less cosmopolitan. We are very aware of the conflicts and tensions posed by refugee crises, migration issues around the world. Never before have the people from the south tried to make their way to the north, and never before has the north been so militaristic in the policing of its own borders to keep out the people of the south. The north, the first world, the west, whatever you want to call it, is very good at promoting the flow of goods and ideas around the world, but it's very, very selective about which bodies can enter and cross particular borders. So we're increasingly seeing how some things are given greater freedom and other things, like the bodies from the south, are increasingly blocked. And I suspect most people would think that most migrants and refugees are trying to get to Australia or other parts of Northern Hemisphere, to Europe or America. The reality is, the vast majority of the refugees are being held in countries next to the country from which they actually originate. So it's in Bangladesh that the Rohingya millions are in, not in Australia, Canada, United States, or North America. It's in Turkey that the vast majority of the Syrians are, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, it's those countries which are having to bear the burden of accommodating, often in circumstances which are unimaginable to us. And this complex network of hospitality and cosmopolitanism, and this advent of these new brutal machines for policing borders in a militaristic manner, has inspired one Cameroonian political philosopher called Achille Mbembe to say that we've entered into an age of necropolitics, because the bodies of the refugees and the migrants are increasingly at risk of death. Now, how do we correct this rather stigmatic view of migrants? I've already implied and suggested that we need new tools to measure these global flows. This was an idea that is not unique to me. It's also been promoted by a historian of migration called Harold Kleinschmidt, who pointed out a long time ago that the flows of global migration are not adequately captured by the existing tools and practices that we have for measuring migration. Most of the research and information and knowledge we have about migration is generated by nation states. They know how many people come in over their borders and how many people leave their borders. Where they go to, what relations they have, what networks they have formed is more opaque. But perhaps the really important information is not in the entry and exit. In other words, the information that only exists in and within your borders and at your borders, but the wider networks that are increasingly transnational. So he not only noticed that we have a serious myopia in the way in which we understand the phenomenon, but also the value system that we generate for understanding migration is also heavily slanted against the migrant. The presumption is that the migrant is suspicious or threatening until proven to be a worthy resident and citizen. So because the nation state presumes that everybody who's in the nation state wants to be a citizen of that state, the perception of those who are outside or have just come in is often a negative one. Now, I'm sure that's very familiar to everyone in this room. But the point is that not only is the information limited, but the perspective is slanted and biased. Now, of course, if you want to shift your perspective, you change your worldview. Or as one famous American anthropologist quipped, from the perspective of a pedestrian, the fish is a lousy walker. In other words, we see things from our own perspective rather than the assets and capacities that the other entity may actually have. Now, there was serious efforts to correct this myopia, or this limited perspective, and one of them was led by a German sociologist called Ulrich Beck. And he said, rather than just having a nationalist framework, we should have a cosmopolitan methodology. A methodology that is alive to the realities of cosmopolitanism and not just to the nation and nationalism. Now, unfortunately, while walking with his wife on New Year's Eve in 2015 in Munich, Ulrich had a heart attack and died on the spot. And since then, I hate to say, no real sustained effort has continued the work that he pioneered. So it's easy to conclude then that in fact, like I was suggesting at the beginning, that cosmopolitanism is existing in a state of utter ruin. It's been shattered by these geopolitical events, and it's feeling more and more less like to be a reality. Now, I'm going to argue that artists often step into these gaps. That artists, when they see a political or cultural scenario that is full of fear, look for new sources of hope. And where they see unfair smears being thrown against migrants, try to present more positive views. So in other words, I think the artists are the first agents who are countering both the populist discourses and the political policies that are being generated against migrants. I'm going to give you two very brief examples of how artists are doing this. This is a Cuban artist called Tania Bruguera. And one of the things she did was to start an international party called Immigrant Movement International. And in a sense, she's not only doing art projects that are about this phenomenon, she's not only running art schools in Havana, she's not only organizing protests and things like that, but she's also initiating a party that represents not people from a particular place, but all people on the move. Here's another example. Palestinian artist called Emily Jassir. She's Palestinian but holds a US passport. And she asks in this project to the Palestinians who are either in exile or in the diaspora, she asks them the question, if there is anything I could do for you anywhere in Palestine, what would it be? In other words, she's saying, I can have access to places that you might not, and I'm happy to facilitate that communication and exchange with you and for you. Now, what we see in these two very brief examples from artists is the efforts to initiate a politics of solidarity and a politics of connection with other people, and to use art as a means to build bridges across differences, to connect people which are otherwise separated. Now, there are countless examples in contemporary art of these kind of bridge-building exercises that artists have begun to deploy and initiate. I won't mention them all. I'll just notice that even art historians, who I have an ambivalent relationship to, but some are very alert to this. Marcia Meskimon in the UK, Terry Smith, an Australian who was based in the US for a long time, they too have been tracking the way artists are increasingly engaged in this bridge building activities with refugees and migrants, to the point where they think that this focus on migration is transforming the way in which the form of art is being conducted and the way in which art is being used to build a new image of the world and a new understanding of global connectedness. Now, I think something important is happening with these two kinds of examples and this phenomenon that the critical discourse is generating around it. And that is, on the one hand, it's confronting that context that I described through Achille Mbembe's term, the necropolitics of globalization, the way artists are confronting the way migrant bodies are being entangled in situations of absolute violence and threat and risk. But not only entangled by the military machines, but also being used as scapegoats. How convenient is to blame the migrant for all the contradictions and tensions of globalization? You know, the working class suffer from it, the lower middle class suffer from it, the middle classes are suffering from it. It's only the top 1 or 5% that are benefiting from it, but all the stigma is being launched against the migrant. So one of the things is we could talk about how these norms and values are being mobilized against migrants and how we can confront that and possibly correct that. But what I think Bruguera and Emily Jasiah do is something important and different. Because on the one hand, you could say what they're doing is doing the work that our civic elites, our politicians, or our civic leaders, like myself, as an academic, right? They're doing the work that we should be doing. They're correcting the misconceptions. They're challenging the stereotypes. They're exposing the falsities. And they're revealing the violence and atrocities that's been done in our name by our state. So in other words, they're confronting the gaps in our normative world, in our moral and political order. But they're using art to do that. So in a sense, there is a long tradition in the philosophy called normative cosmopolitanism, where you get the norms of cosmopolitanism to challenge the deficit in national values, right? So the norms of global equality and global citizenship are used to challenge the deficit in national ideas of equality and citizenship, right? But they're not just challenging these norms, they're also making us rethink about aesthetics, making us rethink about how we experience how our body has a sensory relation to an aesthetic event. So as one philosopher called Stephen Wright said, they're starting to think about this blurring of the aesthetic and the normative, so that in effect that art has a double meaning. Art is no longer just beautiful, because it helps us experience something that's powerful and significant, but also art is something that can be useful. To use Stephen Wright's term, it has a double ontology, it has a double meaning, both beautiful and useful. So here is art that is addressing the fact that our society is increasingly abandoning a whole set of moral values, scapegoating the vulnerable, presenting false information, and effectively exposing people to violence and humiliation and risk of death on a constant basis. So they're trying to confront that norm, but they're doing it as we're also experiencing, not as a moral question, but also as a sensory phenomenon and experience. So it's not just a moral reflection on what's right and wrong, but also an empathic experience, so that when you are thinking about this phenomenon, you're also feeling it. This is an interesting innovation in the way in which the aesthetic and the normative are being fused in the rethinking and reconfiguring of the cosmopolitan. Now, I spent quite a bit of time reflecting on that in my two previous books on cosmopolitanism. I'm not going to go back over that, but what I want to highlight here is that art has often been seen as this mirror thing that reflects back the world to us, or it's often been understood that its function is to be like a lamp that exposes things that were otherwise hidden from us, like the lies and evil that I've just described, the scapegoating that's been used against migrants. But what I'm saying now is that beyond the mirror and the lamp, what art is doing is also creating a world, a sensory experience of the world in which the way you think and feel about phenomenon changes the way in which you register how the world should be. Now, this idea of art as a world-making activity brings us back to the idea of the cosmos and cosmopolitanism. Because the cosmos and cosmopolitanism was always both physical, moral, and aesthetic. Cosmos in ancient Greek referred to that sphere that was around the earth that separated it from the infinite. It was this celestial zone where Logos resided. It was also a reference to the way in which we had ethical relations to the cosmos, all the people. But also, the third meaning of the Greek word was cosmos as order making, a way of creating space that beckons the other, a way of adorning the body to attract the other, a way of using speech that's seductive and powerful. Hence our word cosmetic comes from cosmos. And hence the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy says, all art is cosmological. Let me illustrate this point a little bit further by this little conversation with a group of artists.
Now wait a minute, you're going to back me into a corner, make me lie.
I'm not trying to make it. I'm not trying.
I know you're not.
I
know you're not. But in order to defend myself,
I'm not trying to be right or wrong. I'm trying to learn something.
I am.
Okay.
Trying to be right or wrong.
See, when I see a great violinist like Hilary Hahn and I listen to her play Bach, I know she's an artist. She's interpretive, but she's an artist because the way she's playing Bach, that's her unique connection.
I have no argument with you on that.
I would think that it's the result that makes the art and not necessarily the process that leads to it. So when Hilary plays Bach, that's the music, and what you receive is the art. That's one of the biggest problems of the actor, because the piece of art, the person, in the end, and the performance and everything that leads up to it is so difficult to separate from each other.
Why do they call it performing arts? I mean, for example, when she plays, isn't she channeling something in her imagination to hit the notes in such a way that makes it unique unto her own interpretation?
The technique is the craft. It's the individual qualities that make the art. You can tell a story. How many stories? There are only so many stories in the world.
No,
but
so many plots, a lot of stories.
That's true. But you can tell it. You can take a plot. No, you're right. But you can take a plot. You can tell that plot, create that plot over and over again. It just depends on someone who does it artfully. First of all, it has to be. In order for it to be art, it has to be truthful. Secondly, it has to be individually truthful. And it's that true individuality and that real truth that makes it art.
But there are so many happy accidents that happen in between the lines that are uniquely Morgan Freeman. I've seen him do things where I'm like, wow, where did that come from? And I know where it came from. It came from the imagination, his own personal relationship with the cosmos. So that to me is
Money doesn't drive movies. What does? Here's the answer. Ideas. Watch how a shot of bubbles becomes an idea in movie history. This is a scene from British director Carol Reed's 1946 movie, Odd Man Out. A guy's in a mess, sees his troubles reflected in the bubbles of a spilled drink. Now look at another close-up of bubbles in a drink. Again, a character is in trouble, self-absorbed. This film's director, Jean-Luc Godard, knew and admired Carol Reed's work. So he was probably thinking of Odd Man Out when, 20 years later, he filmed this moment. Now look at Martin Scorsese's film Taxi Driver of 1976. Scorsese loves the films of Carol Reed and Jean-Luc Godard, and so used the same idea that a character looking into bubbles can see their own troubles and also somehow the cosmos.
And also somehow the cosmos. This idea of seeing your troubles in the tiny bubbles is one that I'll come back to over again. But let me now consider another artist, a Korean artist living in Japan called Liu Fan. He's an artist who makes paintings with a single brushstroke. A lot of concentration, preparation goes into that single stroke. But he also says each stroke is timed with the breath. Each breath is aligned with the cosmos. His function as an artist is to be a conductor of the cosmos. Here's David Medalla, a Filipino artist who lived all over the world. He was an artist who never lost sight of the cosmological links between art and politics. This is one of his early works from the 1960s. It used soap and an oxygenator to pump infinite columns of foams, bubble machine, it was called. At the time, in 1961, it was seen as a pioneering work of kinetic art and an exemplar of the way in which the ephemeral could be a subject matter and a means for expressing yourself in contemporary art. But the inspiration from this work comes from two other sources. David Medalla had seen a photo of a freedom fighter who had just been shot in the Philippines, and that close-up was of his face, and the face had tiny little translucent bubbles of saliva and blood forming on the edge of the mouth. And for that political image, for Medalla, was deeply connected with his ongoing project of wanting to have a conversation with the cosmos. That's his phrase. Now, this is where you come in, Costa. That phrase, a conversation with the cosmos, is the heading of an essay written by one of the prominent critics and curators in one of the most influential art magazines called Efflux right now. Now, the essay opens with this beautiful umbrella concept of the cosmos, but what then follows is an inventory of descriptions of materials, events, historical influences, personal relationships, and institutional constraints that Medalla experienced. The word cosmos never appears again in the essay. Now, I'm not picking on this author as an example of someone with a deficit in their cosmological or cosmopolitan imaginary. I'm stressing that that essay that she has produced is normal. It's the conventional way in which art history addresses something that has a cosmological aspiration. It seeks to either zoom in on the material production of the work, the context in which it's made, the tools that were used, or talk about the genre and style that was deployed. In other words, it's an index of the difficulty that we have to register the claim that the artist makes about his her own work. A claim that they say is the most important and most fundamental claim in their work. And by contrast, the 6th century philosopher Pythagoras was once asked by his students, why are we on this earth? Why are human beings here on this planet? Pythagoras replied, our job is to look at the skies. Now, I'm going to take up that challenge that Pythagoras offered philosophers and say, what have we done to think about our connection to the cosmos? Now, since Pythagoras and since the Stoics that were already mentioned, a lot of literature has been written in philosophy about cosmopolitanism. But the one thing you'll never find in that vast body of literature is the idea that cosmopolitanism is alive and well here and now. Or that cosmopolitanism is something that ordinary people without moral philosophical training can do for themselves. At best, we find countless examples of how to improve our political structures, how to refine our moral conduct, how to enhance our curiosity for other societies, and therefore, if we perfect that political, moral, and cultural capacity, at some point in the future, we'll arrive at a cosmopolitan order. What you never ever see in philosophy, the mainstream philosophy, I would argue, is the idea that cosmopolitanism can actually exist in the present. I'm not trying to say that what we have is as good as it gets. Obviously, it can get worse. In fact, it probably will. But I am trying to sort of help us distinguish between the signs that philosophical leaders have told us to look for in order to identify where and when philosophy begins. Now, going back to the Stoics, the ancient Greeks, they also thought that you became cosmopolitan once you detached yourself from all the constraints of your society. So if you were attuned to the cosmos, then you no longer needed moral guidance, you no longer needed political leadership, you no longer needed medical advice, you no longer needed legal guidance on anything. You could do those things for yourself because you were attuned to the essential beauty and truth of the cosmos. But to achieve that stage, you had to be a sage. And as Zeno said, I ain't met one yet. In other words, it's not going to be something that's going to happen in this world. The Christian theologians had a similar view that, you know, it's not the world as we know it here and now that can be cosmopolitan, to use St. Paul's phrase, but it's our dedication and sacrifices that we make in this world in the pursuit of absolute love for the next world that gets us there. So once again, ain't going to be found here and now. Come fast forward to the age of the Enlightenment and the great engineer of reason, Immanuel Kant, and you see that he starts to think about how can we have cosmopolitanism and why do we need it? Firstly, he says we need it because European colonialism can't go on forever. We have literally run out of territory. There is a limit to this earth. So we're going to collide with each other pretty soon, and we're going to have to negotiate with each other, and we're going to have to find some kind of system, and he preferred a non-coercive form of federal system, to negotiate our differences and find peace and security. Now, he then broke that ambition down to small parts, like a good engineer would, but realized that even with the best political will, the finest moral guidance, and the most sensitive aesthetic capacities, that is not going to be enough to secure cosmopolitanism. Because, like many other philosophers, his inherent belief was that human nature was essentially destructive and violent, and that we needed to temper that human nature. And all the good morality and political structures in the world isn't sufficient to keep that under control. What is it going to actually help us overcome this warring tendency that would otherwise take us to the grave? he had the belief that there was an inherent tendency in history and in nature towards self-improvement. That we learn from our mistakes through history, and that nature itself, physi, will eventually work its way towards developing a system that actually secures perfection. So he had this belief in the progressive logic of the world. Now, 200 years later, there is no contemporary philosopher, as much as they admire the sophistication of the philosophical edifice that Kant built, there's no contemporary philosopher today that actually believes that history and nature will deliver us to this heightened state of cosmopolitanism. On the contrary, it's nature that seems to be at risk, and history seems to be the thing that's taking us further to that. And if we don't learn to control that, we'll all fall into the abyss. So, in a sense, people like Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, and Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, who are very different in many ways, but totally agreed when they talked about cosmopolitanism. They believe that the future for cosmopolitanism is based on some kind of understanding of how language operates. Now, for Habermas, the argument was that if we speak clearly and openly and transparently with each other, then he says there is a glimmer of ideality that comes from that dialogue, a little view of all the positive things that could happen in the world, and the basis for securing what he called constitutional patriotism. In other words, a political system, mostly liberal democratic, that would enable people to generate some kind of peace and security with each other. Derrida wasn't so confident about that issue of transparency, but nevertheless he also believed that language was the key and had the mystical force to open up a better view of the world. And that it's through the operations of language that we produce a critique of this world and can actually form new means of communication with others. Now, once again, both of these philosophers, very much celebrated all around the world today, both of them are saying that what we have is not cosmopolitanism today, and that what we might have, if we followed some of these steps, is a cosmopolitanism in the future. Now, I've promised to offer an alternative view to that. I've already suggested that artists have always insisted that the cosmos is central to their creative work. Now I want to talk about, in conclusion, another way of thinking about what actually is occurring in the here and now in everyday life. One British cultural theorist called Stephen Toulmin has actually argued that our whole viewpoint of cosmopolitanism is totally skewed against it. And that he believes that, in fact, that the key concept is the concept of tolerance. Because he recognizes that people have differences, and that these differences are not going to be resolved just because we agree on some political system like Habermas thinks we could, but that what we need to accept is not just the political procedures for expressing and articulating those differences, but we need to accept that these differences actually just matter and that we can live with them. And living with someone who has a different view to you is not a sign of weakness. He says, in fact, that's a sign of strength. And that in the fullness of time, in the habit of coexisting with others, we develop means to work our way through these differences without having to impose our view over the other. So this is a very complex and sophisticated view of the concept of tolerance. Another philosopher and literary theorist called Sheldon Pollock has argued that, in fact, cosmopolitan isn't just the monopoly of philosophers who have the capacity to, and the time and resources to reflect on great universals. He argues that, in fact, ordinary people in everyday life are constantly combining big abstractions with their everyday realities. They are constantly thinking, how do I connect my everyday practice with these big value systems? So he says, in everyday life, it's not that until we have the right moral system that we then become cosmopolitan, but rather it's important to see how cosmopolitanism already operates in the fibre of our being, in the practices of our relationship with others, in the way in which we conduct ourselves in this world. So he's celebrating the capacity that we have to coexist, the fact that we can see difference around us all the time, that we go to the footy on the weekend just to hear ourselves scream, and even if our team lose, doesn't mean we want to kill ourselves or everybody from the other side, which of course does happen in England all the time. But here in Australia, we don't do that. We appreciate the strength and elegance of our adversaries. Now, that might sound like a trivial example that I've just given about suburban attitudes towards the footy and how after the match as a kid, my brother and I would go out in the backyard and pretend, take it in turns as who's going to do the jezza. But my point in that is that in these little micro examples, we are emulating something that we saw as profoundly beautiful. Jezza jumping up and taking a great mark was a defiance of gravity. We'd never seen that before. And that was our attempt to emulate, to repeat that. In a sense, that's what art does all the time. The great philosopher Wittgenstein says, when the eye sees something beautiful, it wants to draw. The hand wants to draw. What is the hand doing to the information that the eye has given it to it? The hand is bringing forth, making, but also including itself in the scene of beauty. It's making another world. It's making us see ourselves inside that bubble of beauty. And at that moment, all our energy, all our mass vibrates with the cosmos. Just like the way in which a wave, as it passes over the sand, is creating a shift in perspective all the time. Now, I'm coming to the final part of this lecture, and I want to talk about a viewpoint that has been developed by a Belgian philosopher of science called Isabel Stengers. She's a philosopher and historian of science. I find it difficult to understand what she says, but there's an essay that she wrote called The Cosmopolitical Proposal, which is exemplary. Her starting point is the opposite of Immanuel Kant, who she saw as this great engineer of the Enlightenment period, who broke everything down to parts and then created a structure so that everything fits together again. And so Immanuel Kant, like many philosophers, basically thought that we will get to a better place if the leaders of this world listen to the good philosophers of this world. So under the guidance of the philosopher, the leaders will take the masses to a better places, but the masses themselves, they're not capable of doing anything good for themselves. They'll just commit suicide and kill each other. So it's only under the good moral guidance of the leaders by the philosophers that we eventually get to cosmopolitanism, right? That's Immanuel Kant in a nutshell. I'm sorry if I'm being crude and reductive. But Isabel Stenger takes an opposite viewpoint. She says the agent of cosmopolitanism is the idiot. The idiot is a figure that Dostoevsky portrayed in his beautiful novel, but also other philosophers have also celebrated, like Lacan, Dieu, Zizek. And the idiot is not someone who has a grand plan, but someone who bumbles along. The idiot is not someone who's unaware of all the things, but is able to connect different things in subtle and in nimble ways. The idiot is someone who, in other words, rejects the idea that you need a real clear roadmap to get to someone, but is confident enough and capable enough to find the connections as he or she goes. So she celebrates a figure who is not like the great engineer, but is someone who's prepared to make it up as they go. And someone who shrugs their shoulder whenever an authority appears to tell them what's right and wrong. Someone who knows how to duck and weave when the bullies, called our leaders, are telling us what is important. Now, what she's also doing is giving us an insight into a different kind of operational logic. Because Immanuel Kant, remember, was writing in the age of the Enlightenment, 18th and 19th centuries, right? When the age of the machine was dominating our imagination. So integrating parts to make a machine so that it works more effectively, more efficiently. Now, what Stenger says is that viewpoint from machine logic doesn't actually work at the big or the micro level. When you zoom out to the cosmos, if you try to explain things according to that machine logic, it doesn't operate that way. When you zoom down to the level of the subatomic, similarly, the way in which particles are moving with each other, similarly don't follow according to those rules. So she's suggesting that maybe if we want to see how someone like the idiot functions and how cosmopolitanism actually exists, then it's time to get a new optic, a quantum version of cosmopolitanism, one that can register the activities at the above and below, but the otherwise very effective and powerful and dominant tools of the nation state have completely ignored and missed. And if you don't have that tool, everything that is said in the name of cosmopolitanism will seem idiotic, unreal, invisible. And so we have this figure in Stenger's work of the idiot, a person who rejects the use of power, a person like Diogenes, who when Alexander the Great says, "Tell me what you want and I'll give it to you," and he says, "Just get out of the sun." The figure of Diogenes is like this figure of the idiot, someone who is not attached to a master plan, someone who's working it out as he goes, someone who has realized that freedom is through minimizing attachment and maximizing self-sufficiency. So Stenger's is, in a sense, critiquing the dominant modes of governance. She's showing us how the idiot figure who's a bit slow, who seems dumb and obdurate, is actually got the key to a different kind of intelligence, a deceleration rather than acceleration, a non-conformity rather than a compliance. And she's saying that the idiot finds connections which otherwise are missed. And she makes a very, very important distinction here. She says the dominant model for understanding change is based on equivalence, seeing how these parts fit together, right? So this has to be equivalent to that for the machine to work. She says it doesn't work like that. But that doesn't mean we throw out equivalence, but what we need is a notion of equalization. So equivalence assumes that when you put the pieces together, they have to be made consistent. And so that there has to be a standard that measures how the parts relate to each other. Now, the moment you introduce that standard, you're effectively saying that the identity of the parts has to be predetermined according to the model of the system in order for it to be equivalent, right? And that is doing violence to the parts, because you're cutting off the excesses or you're having to fill in the deficits so that it becomes equivalent with something else, right? And you can start to relate this and build analogies in your mind in terms of how, as a migrant kid, you are trying to fit in to your environments to be equivalent with others. So, on the one hand, she's talking about particles, right, and physics. On the other hand, it applies perfectly to subjectivity. Now, equalization, however, is operating according to a different set of associations and possibilities so that the assemblage is generated even if the parts don't neatly fit with each other. And in fact, the discordant parts sometimes become stimulants and productive elements in the dynamics of coming together. So she's producing a way of thinking about how parts come together to form an assemblage to create a common, whereby the parts don't have to follow a predetermined and prescribed set of identities. Now, I think that's enormously important for the way in which we think about identity and the way in which we can think about cosmopolitanism. And it also takes us back to the ancient Greek Stoic idea of the cosmos. Because I said that the Stoics believed that the cosmos was this sphere that separated the earth from the infinite, from the palm. But that sphere was always self-generating. It was in a state of ekpyrosis. The flames were bursting out and then contracting again and then somehow regenerating themselves. I think what Isabel Stengers is pointing to is the capacity for ignition to occur in nature, where there is more coming out than is put in. And this is an important point to end on. I want to end on one other anecdote, because, did I miss something? I want to end on another anecdote because I talked about how Immanuel Kant, and I would say the dominant tradition of philosophy, not all, but the dominant tradition of philosophy, presupposes that our human nature is primarily violent and destructive. Kant has this phrase called asocial sociality, that left to our own devices, we would be lustful, violent, destructive, self-interested creatures. And at best, as a second order, our social skills, our moral and family values kick in to control that primary urge for destruction and violence on others. Now, I am not an idiot, or, well, I am a little bit of an idiot in that sense, but I'm not naive enough to believe that we are not capable of those things. Of course we are. But I resent and reject this idea of primacy and secondariness. That the primacy of our identity as humans, of our human nature, is violence, and only subsequently we acquire a capacity to control that. My belief is that humans are both violent and creative, and both are primary, and that we have this capacity to create and connect and care, and that is equally primary. Let me end with a little anecdote that illustrates this point, and which I think is fundamental for thinking about cosmopolitanism. There's a very famous anthropologist from America called Margaret Mead, and she did what many people do at the end of their careers, which is go on little tours and talk to school kids about what it is that they have done in their life and what does it mean to be an anthropologist in their life. And one kid said to her, "What is the first sign of culture?" What is the first sign of culture? And she thought long and hard about this. And the expected answer was that they said, we found this tool, we found this weapon, we found this artwork. She said that the first sign of culture was the fact that they found this skeleton in Indonesia where the person must have broken their leg at a young age because there was still evidence of a fracture that had healed on the femur. So the reason why she says this is the first sign of civilization, because that bone predates any artifact that we've ever found, but that bone is evidence that somebody must have cared for that person for 6 weeks in order for that person to live to an older age. And there we have an example of the primacy of care. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nico. What an incredible talk you've just given us. I'm amazed that you can talk about the same topic that you did on the night that Olivia hosted the book, and you presented it in a completely different context tonight. I think that is creativity at its best, and we all thank you for it. Now, does anybody have any questions? They're all stunned.
It's your job.
No.
Hello, Professor. I came here, I didn't know anything about this cosmos. Are we leftists looking for a new Soviet dogma? Is this a new rehash? The utopia that we failed the last 70 years has disappeared. Are we trying to rehash something old again? I'm with you. I agree with everything, but I'm also human, and I'm less than an idiot. So, and I'm a little bit old to believe in the doctrines of Marx as I get older, and I am searching for answers. Is this a rehash?
No, on one level, the answer is because Marxism had an internationalist agenda. It believed in radical equality for all workers of the world, and it identified an agent that would bring this utopia into being, which was the proletarian. And so it had a vision of how equality would come into the world. And so their version of cosmopolitanism was really driven by the bottom up of the industrial machine, the workers. About 30 or 40 years later, an Italian Marxist called Antonio Gramsci comes up with a different vision. He says that it's not just the workers in the factories that are the agents of a new civilization, it's also the peasants, whom Marx thought as idiots. Marx had all the stereotypical prejudicial views of peasants that were typical of a gentleman of his age. And by the way, when he died, the person at births and deaths registry couldn't find a clear occupation to assign to him next to his name. As a consequence, wrote down gentleman. But so Marx had a myopia as well about what was the means by which a new internationalism will come into the world. The consequence of that is that it obliterated the value of a lot of other peasant cultures in Europe and also indigenous cultures around the world. So one of the arguments I believe we need to make, and this is not a rehash because I don't think it's ever happened before, the argument we need to make is to find the resources, the vocabulary and perspective to not only think about a new kind of cosmopolitanism for ourselves, but also a cosmopolitanism that can chime and communicate with other cosmologies, indigenous cosmologies. So obviously, I think it's important for me, as someone of Greek heritage, to identify two very important traditions in my background. One is the cosmologies that came from pre-Christian Hellenic knowledge. Another is also an attitude to the land that's pre-industrial. That's peasant-based. That was what my parents come from. And those values of stewardship and understanding of sustainability in the land may be vital starting points to develop dialogues with people of indigenous perspectives and knowledge in this country. Without that, I don't see how I can have a conversation.
Thank you for that. It was very interesting. I had so many questions. This, we did many hours, but there's a couple of things I'd like to talk about. Firstly, it was interesting because you mentioned it wasn't right till the end of your your lecture that you talked about culture. And if we're talking about our Greek ancestors, the context in which they discussed the cosmos was very different to what it is today. And you also talked about the syntax of language, but I'm more interested in the syntax of culture and how what role that plays in perpetuating or understanding the cosmos itself. And I don't know if you're familiar with Roderick Beaton, but he writes a lot about Greek culture and history, and he's an Englishman. He speaks Greek better than I do. And his view is obviously about our culture, is that it's not about place, it's about culture and identity. And Greek people over the many years, millennia, have struggled with this idea, particularly with our occupation, with the Ottomans. So my question to you is, the syntax of culture surely must play a pivotal role in terms of how we operate globally, and technology, and as we progress, that gets redefined. So our ancestors back 600 BC must have had a very different understanding of culture and the cosmos than we do today. Same as Kant and same as the modernists in the 50s.
That is an extremely equally sophisticated and complex question. The ancient Greek etymologies of certain keywords is fascinating. Nomos is one of them, which refers to place, but also the relationship to the divine. So when you had voting rights, it was determined by your nomos. But that wasn't just your notion of place, it also was your relationship to the cosmos. So from the outset, and this is where Carl Schmitt, a very famous German philosopher, completely skewed that thing by talking nomos for the world, by reducing it to territory in the most offensive and aggressive territorial ways, which would justify the Nazi ideology. But let's not go there. But my point is that etymology of that term is that it highlights that place and culture are not mutually exclusive, but are in some kind of symmetry to start with. Of course, with time and different kinds of geopolitical regimes, whether they're feudal, imperial, national, place becomes dominant metaphor for understanding identity. By placing someone, you suddenly claim the boundaries of their identity. I feel that that's one of the greatest misconceptions that we've ever created for humanity, the idea that our identity was determined by territorial boundaries. I think the idea of culture through language, which has a much more porous and much more ambiguous notion of place, is far more subtle. Like, why did the Byzantines call themselves Romans? Romeo. You know, much more sophisticated and supple and fluid notion of their identity. And this, I think, is an important thing to reclaim. I agree with you 100% about how we need to overcome that territorialization and stigmatic containment of identity to particular places. Of course, place is significant, and in places, stories are told, and places are triggers and containers of memories and experiences, but it's not necessarily equivalent, to use that term, to the way in which you relate to the world as a whole. So if we are to be cosmopolitan, the first thing we need to do is explode the primacy of place and to open up place to a much more fluid and cosmic set of connections. This is the collision of culture is an interesting phrase because there was this famous thesis by Huntington, the clash of civilizations. What happens when two civilizations meet and clash? And I think this is a very, very valid point. What happens if there are differences? If we take the argument that's developed about the principle of tolerance, every civilization will recognize that there are other worldviews, that it doesn't have monopoly on truth. Any civilization worth its value will admit the interest it has in the engagement with other worldviews. So when two civilizations clash, that doesn't mean that they are out to destroy and kill each other. By definition, they're out to be in conversation with each other. And in conversation, they may not necessarily come to a consensus in the first instance, but what I've argued through the example of Sheldon and Toulmin is that we can develop the patience and openness to find solutions in time, which may not be available in the first instance. And one of the qualities of a civilized society and a civilized person is that calmness in the face of difference, and that curiosity and that willingness to be patient and allow the solution and the possibilities that there may not necessarily be, a total agreement, but there might be sufficient understanding so that they can continue to coexist. So when cultures collide, as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean that they negate and eliminate each other. It means that they have to find ways to cooperate with each other.
Thanks, Nikos, for an excellent presentation. I have a question about what role, if any, is there for science in cosmopolitanism? Because the last time I had a cosmological experience, it was through contemplating the sciences, the latest results of the James Webb Telescope, based on infrared technology. Galaxies far off weren't where they were supposed to be. As I looked into it more, looked into the results and the theorization, it actually led me back to the pre-Socratic or pre-Platonic question of why is there something rather than nothing? And there's no answer to that, which sort of strikes out the W of the whole. It leaves a hole, H-O-L-E. Yeah. And is that what sets the imaginary going?
Yeah.
The artistic process, and gets us thinking in terms of cosmopolitanism again. When we follow science to the edge of the boundary, where we realise how much we still don't know, because there's questions we can never fully answer, and that's when we start creatively imagining some kind of whole with the W again.
Oh, great question again. I have to confess, to begin, that I am ashamed of my ignorance of science. I was allergic to it as a kid at school, and avoided it and thought that by doing humanities I'd never have to touch it. And in my last 5 or 10 years, maybe like you, I've discovered that science is some of the most beautiful and interesting research and ideas that are circulating today. I was a student at Cambridge, and I used to see Stephen Hawking on his little machine going by, and one of his PhD students used to be part of my quiz club, and she was genius, and so I became in awe of the ways in which they were thinking about the meaning of everything, the whole, as you say. And since then, I can't say I've learnt anything, because I still can't do anything beyond basic arithmetic, but I have become more and more in awe of the way in which science has poetics, and poetics is science. I love it when scientists say, well, it doesn't quite feel right. It hasn't got that ring to it yet. And that a lot of scientists say that a formula is true when it has also an elegance to it, an aesthetic quality. And also some of the most productive and exciting examples of art today are the collaborations artists are having with scientists. CERN, the great laboratory, the French-Swiss, has countless artist in residency programs which are producing great outcomes. Now, I still am an absolute beginner. I love reading the sort of simple versions of science, of Hawking's, Ravelli. Ravelli is one of the great thinkers, I think, in this area, and also one of the most beautiful, Carlo Ravelli, the Italian loop theory scientist. And what I find interesting in him in terms of your discussion, and also of Hawking's, is that the way in which the ancient Greeks are revered. They're not set up, because almost all of these books start with Anaximander. Not with Plato and Aristotle, but with Anaximander. Or make reference to Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics. And of course, you know, this could be a sort of an acknowledgement to some moment in the past when, haha, we had these fanciful ideas, but now we've learned the truth. And it's not as simple as that. They're not saying that they provided the blueprint which we're now proving true or false, but they're saying that they had the capacity to imagine things through the power of analogy that we're only now starting to also realize how profound they were. And so I find that raw intelligence and that scientific model that was at the essence of philosophy in the ancient world, which is really powerful because it showed that poetics, philosophy, science, and ethics may be four different categories of philosophy, but are fundamentally part of the same thing.
Last question.
Thank you, Nico. That was an excellent presentation. I just want to ask you, what do you think the education's role will have on bringing out our humanity? Because the governments are asking for conformity, the citizens are ignorant of indifference, and as a practical person, the only way that I think we will be enlightened in this kind of going towards cosmopolitanism is to educate the citizen. I mean, Australia is a perfect place. We've got all the nationalities of the world in here, but we are still very tribal.
Oh, yeah.
And we do not respect indifference. So in theory, in practical terms, what do we actually do to achieve or a path towards cosmopolitanism?
Well, the first thing we do is to acknowledge the equality of all people. And so when the first question was posed, it was posed from a position, correct me if I'm wrong, of relative ignorance, you said. You said you weren't informed and embedded in this tradition, but you were curious and open-minded and less than an idiot in terms of how you explored it. I think your question was as profound as my colleague, who's a professional philosopher and much more advanced and much more intricately informed about this body of knowledge that I was talking about than I am, but I think the questions are equally profound. And so that's my first answer to your question, is that pedagogy isn't the only solution. It isn't just how we teach our kids, it's how we operate in the world. And how we operate in the world may well be more cosmopolitan than what our institutions enable us to deliver. I'm working still, in the last dying minutes, at a university. Every day it seems less and less a cosmopolitan place, less and less a place where trust and curiosity and experimentation is being harnessed and nurtured, and more a place where instrumental information is being delivered according to, you know, rigid criteria, and in the name of being creative. Bullshit. So I'm increasingly pessimistic, less than an idiot, but I'm also hopeful that our human capacities, I'm pessimistic about the institutions. I mean, I'm not saying that this absolves them of responsibility. On the contrary, they should be enhancing curiosity. they should be delivering greater information about the value of cultural diversity. All the arguments that I said about defending cosmopolitanism at the beginning of my talk are perfectly honourable and valid. What I'm stressing, however, is that that's not enough. And if we rely on that moral, normative discourse, we're not going to see the solution. We need to get into the ways in which people are actually experiencing and feeling the world, how they're conducting themselves with other people. And in effect, the future of cosmopolitanism may be just as simple as, how do I hang out with my neighbour? No. Then we would all be just dupes. Yes, society can influence us, and it can shape us to a great extent, but it doesn't control and determine us. I still think we have the imagination to say no. We have the capacity to say, I'm interested in something else, and the sneaky ability, the cunning to find ways to turn the system against itself. Otherwise, what's the point of being in an institution like a university these days? Because it's just become a corporate machine. And if you want to really have humanitarian and cosmopolitan and intellectual and aesthetic and artistic values, you've got to work against the grain of the machine. Yeah, and so the system following the system won't be the solution. We have to rebel.
One last question. Last one, I promise.
That's what you said before.
I lied.
Again.
Thanks. Nico, I found your lecture very poetic. It really touched me.
Thank you.
And you ran through the whole history of philosophy in an hour. That's pretty amazing. I love the thing about the bubbles in the glass, and I find that people are violent and destructive, like Kant said, but at the same time, the creative people are the ones that can see the bubble in the glass. The destructive and the violent people do not. And there's like two different races, and that's why I think we will never, ever become like cosmopolitan, like we want to be. Because the leaders will not listen to the people. They never did from Plato's time, because Plato was the first to say that. The leaders did not listen to the philosophers from antiquity until now. Sadly, I actually wanted to ask you what you think. I know this is very, I'm leaving. What you think of the migrants in Greece. Greece is used as a dumping ground of human souls by the EU, and especially now, which is really sad. I mean, the migrants coming from Lebanon and Palestine, and the way the people of Greece are reacting. No, this is a real tragedy that we're confronted with, and I just wanted to see what you think about that.
That's a very topical question, and it deserves a good answer. I'll do my best. First of all, in terms of the references to the bubbles, I could listen to that Irish man's voice forever. It's so seductive. Everything he says, I can just believe. Mark Cousins is his name. It's a 7-part series about the history of film. It's delicious. I don't know what it means, but I just love it. But I don't think I heard you correctly, but I thought you said there are two races. I think there are people with two faces. Two faces. We have both a violent face and a creative face. There aren't violent races and creative races. I think there are people who are split. And that is, I think, the tension that we all embody. And so how that gets played out in the example you've just given us with the reception of refugees in Lesbos, for instance, or in Athens, is a very interesting example of how the dominant powers want to compartmentalize problems. So it would suit Germany, Hungary, England, France perfectly to keep that problem on the edges of Europe, right? To pay off North Africa, pay off Turkey, to control the tap, so to speak, and to give the minimum of support and structures for the reception of the refugees in Greece, and that as a consequence, tension inevitably escalates, and so that people's goodwill eventually frays, and that people who started off with a degree of hospitality in Lesbos and opened their doors and gave their clothes become exhausted, one, but resentful, two. Resentful, why? Not because that they're the front door of this problem, but because the bigger engine has turned its back on the phenomenon. Germany says, you deal with this, we'll give you some crumbs to deal with it. Not all the resources that are necessary, a fraction of it. But they'll spend fortune on global tracking systems that monitor the movement of refugees. They'll spend fortunes on militaristic interventions. They'll spend fortunes on bureaucratic processes. But when it comes to actually giving humanitarian aid or providing social and welfare support or creating avenues of economic development and opportunity, that's just a joke. As a consequence, the people who are on the doorstep of this phenomenon, not just the refugees, but also the Greeks in Lesbos, and I'm saying this because I've just spent 2 months in Singapore, and one of my PhD students there is from Bangladesh, and he has been working with the UN, UNHCR, in fact, for the reception of the Rohingya. Exactly the same phenomenon. The Bangladeshis are dealing with a phenomenon that they didn't cause. This is a humanitarian issue, so this is something for the world to deal with, and yet you make a poor state with peanuts being given to them by the UN to deal with a human catastrophe of a scale that's unimaginable to us. So when I said that the great misconception that we have is that the refugees and the migrants are all coming to us, that's not true. The vast majority of migrants are circulating in networks outside of the north, and the vast majority of refugees are in countries next to the country from which they've originated, which is a long way from us. So who's shouldering the burden? Not us. And yet we're the ones presenting ourselves as the victims in all this. And as a consequence of that fraying and resentment and exhaustion, who do people take out their anger against? Not the German politician, but the neighbour.
Well, I think on that sombre note, we might conclude. Nick, I thank you. And I'm sure everybody here wishes you well on your future endeavours and your travels. But before you go to the University of Bologna, you've got a book launch here, John Berger and me, with Christos Tsokos in conversation on November the 6th. That is certainly something not to be missed. So thank you for your support for the lecture series this year. Nick Dallas and Spirit of the Living Material will bring it back to you bigger and better next year. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.